The audience inside the auditorium was buzzing with the usual excitement that filled an America's Got Talent night, but no one knew that the most unforgettable performance of the evening would come from the smallest and the oldest duo ever to walk on that stage. The lights dimmed and glowed back up as two figures appeared at the entrance, a tiny 4-year-old girl holding the trembling hand of an 87-year-old woman. The contrast between them drew immediate whispers. The little girl walked barefoot, her toes curled slightly as if she wasn't used to cold studio floors. The grandmother wore a faded floral dress and an oversized coat that didn't match any sense of style but spoke volumes about a life lived without comfort. Her white hair was thin and messy, the kind that only comes from sleeping outdoors in the wind instead of on a pillow. They moved slowly, like they had practiced this walk 1,000 times but still weren't sure if the world would accept them. Judges watched silently, curious, trying to understand their story before it was even told. The child tightened her grip on the grandmother's hand, and the grandmother whispered something into her ear, something too soft for the microphones to catch, but whatever it was brought the smallest smile to the little girl's face. Simon leaned forward first, looking at them with a mix of disbelief and tenderness. He didn't say anything yet. The other judges also waited, not wanting to overwhelm the fragile pair. The little girl stepped toward the mic, standing on her toes as if the world was too tall for her. Her voice, tiny and breathy, came out like a whisper floating through a quiet forest. She said that they were here to sing a duet. When asked why they chose to perform together, the girl glanced at her grandmother, and the grandmother looked down, trying to stay composed. The child finally said that they lived together on the streets and singing was how they survived. They sang on sidewalks, in parks, outside grocery stores, anywhere people might stop long enough to listen. Sometimes they earned enough for food. Sometimes they didn't, but singing together kept them warm inside when the nights grew cold. The auditorium grew so silent that even breathing felt loud. The grandmother's eyes glistened as she tried to speak, but her voice cracked. Emotional words couldn't escape her throat, so the little girl stepped closer and held her hand again. That small gesture melted half the audience right away. The judges exchanged looks, understanding that this wasn't going to be an ordinary audition. When the music cue was requested, the pair nodded to each other as if they had a secret language built through hardship. A soft piano instrumental began, the kind that carries memories and heartbreak in every note. The grandmother took a deep breath, her thin chest rising like it was fighting gravity. The girl clutched her dress gently. As the grandmother started to sing the first line, her voice shook at first, as though time had worn down its strength. But then something magical happened. The sound became steady, pure, and unexpectedly beautiful. It was the kind of voice that held decades of pain, love, and sacrifice. People in the audience instinctively turned toward one another with widened eyes. They didn't expect a homeless grandmother to sound like that. Even Simon blinked twice, slowly, because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The child watched her grandmother sing with admiration, like she was watching her hero. Then she joined in. Her voice was small, innocent, and sweet, carrying the purity only a child untouched by bitterness can still hold. Instead of clashing, their voices melted together like sunlight touching old wood, the wisdom of age blending with the gentleness of youth. The audience was stunned. Every note they sang told a story about cold nights, about shared crumbs of bread, about fear, about hope, about the bond between two people who only had each other in a world that had forgotten them. The grandmother's voice cracked at one point mid-verse, but the little girl squeezed her hand and continued confidently, guiding her through. That single moment made the entire auditorium gasp. It was like watching a 4-year-old carry an entire life's worth of pain with grace. The cameras zoomed in on the grandmother's trembling hands, on the child's determined eyes, on the judges who were frozen, unable to even blink. A wave of emotion swept through the crowd. Some audience members covered their mouths. Some wiped tears away, some simply stared, mesmerized. As the song grew, so did their presence. The grandmother lifted her voice higher than anyone expected she could, and the little girl echoed her softly. They created harmonies no professional training could ever produce. Their harmony wasn't perfect in a technical way. It was perfect in a human way, the kind that hits your soul rather than your ears. Midway through the performance, something changed in the grandmother's expression. It was as if she realized for the first time that people were not just listening, they were admiring. She looked around slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief. A tear escaped her eye and slid down her wrinkled cheek, but she did not stop singing. The little girl saw this and stepped closer, pressing their shoulders together. That tiny gesture made her grandmother's voice grow stronger, steadier, braver. The song's bridge arrived, the emotional peak. The music dropped slightly, and only their voices carried the room. The grandmother closed her eyes and let her life pour out. The child sang with such innocence it broke every heart in the building into softer pieces. That contrast, age and youth, hardship and purity, created a kind of magic that no one in AGT had ever witnessed before. When they reached the final line, they sang it together, perfectly synchronized despite the 83 years between them. As their last note floated through the air, the entire auditorium stood up all at once. It was not a planned standing ovation. It was instinct, raw and uncontrollable. People clapped, screamed, cried, cheered. It felt like the whole world inside that room wanted to wrap them in love. The grandmother looked overwhelmed, her hands shaking uncontrollably now. She wasn't used to applause. Applause was something other people received. Not someone who slept with a blanket of newspapers and cardboard. Not someone who spent winters in shelters and summers under bridges. Not someone who had been invisible for decades. Yet here she stood, seen by thousands, appreciated, cherished, celebrated. The little girl smiled, but it wasn't a regular child's smile. It was the smile of someone who had learned too early that life is difficult but love can still be soft. She tugged at her grandmother's hand and whispered that she did amazing. The grandmother broke down crying. She covered her mouth in disbelief while looking toward the cheering audience. The judges waited for the applause to fade, but it didn't. The crowd kept clapping. Even after the producers dimmed the lights slightly, people stayed standing. They were witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Finally, the cheers softened enough for the judges to speak. The little girl rested her head against her grandmother's arm as if she was tired. Months of street life had left her fragile, but performing made her strong again. Simon spoke first. His voice was softer than usual, almost trembling. He said that he had seen thousands of auditions, but there was something indescribable about this one. He said their performance wasn't just about singing, it was a lesson in love, survival, and courage. He told them that they were proof that talent exists everywhere, even in places society chooses not to look. The grandmother's eyes filled with even more tears as Simon continued. He said that her voice carried decades of untold stories, and the little girl's voice carried the future. Together, they created something unforgettable. Simon wasn't trying to be emotional, he simply couldn't stop himself. Something in their performance had struck deep inside him. Heidi was crying openly now. She said that she couldn't imagine what they had gone through, but she felt honored to witness such a pure connection between them. She praised them for singing from the heart and said that their bond was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Howie said he was speechless. He said he had never felt so emotionally overwhelmed during an audition. He explained that it wasn't just a performance, it was a reminder that hope can survive anywhere, even in old coats and tiny bare feet. Sophia said the grandmother reminded her of her own grandmother and that seeing her sing with her granddaughter reminded her of the warmth of family. She said their performance was healing, not just entertaining. As each judge spoke, the grandmother kept holding the child closer. It was clear that she wasn't used to hearing kind words, at least not from strangers. Every compliment felt like a gift she had never expected. Then came the moment everyone had unknowingly been waiting for. Simon paused, looked at the audience, looked at the duo again, and placed his hand on the golden buzzer. The auditorium erupted even before he pressed it. The grandmother gasped. The child stepped back, confused at first. And then Simon pushed the button. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling, raining down in a brilliant shower of light. The little girl reached out her hands, giggling as the confetti fell onto her palms. The grandmother stared upward, shaking, crying, overwhelmed. Something inside her cracked, not in a painful way, but in a way that released years of buried hurt. She fell to her knees as the child wrapped her small arms around her neck. The entire room watched them in silence and admiration as they held each other under the golden rain. Crew members rushed in to help the grandmother stand, but she insisted she was fine. She held her granddaughter tightly and whispered that they finally had a chance to change their lives. It wasn't the money or the fame she cared about. It was the recognition, the dignity, the chance to be seen as human again. The judges came on stage to congratulate them. Simon hugged the little girl gently, careful not to startle her. The grandmother reached out to shake his hand, but Simon hugged her too. She cried again. The moment was overwhelming for everyone. As they walked off the stage, the grandmother looked back one last time at the audience. For decades, she had been ignored by people passing her on sidewalks. But tonight, thousands of strangers rose for her. They didn't look away. They didn't judge. They celebrated her. Backstage, the little girl asked her grandmother if this meant they wouldn't have to sleep outside anymore. The grandmother didn't answer right away. Her voice cracked as she finally whispered that she hoped so. She prayed so. She said that maybe, just maybe, the world finally opened a door for them. The producers interviewed them briefly. The little girl said she wanted to buy a warm bed for her grandmother if they won. The grandmother gently corrected her, saying they would buy a warm bed for both of them. Tears flowed again backstage. Crew members hugged them like family. As the grandmother and granddaughter left the studio that night, they didn't walk like two people struggling through life. They walked like two people carrying hope. The grandmother held her head higher, steps steadier than before. The child hummed the song they just performed. They looked up at the night sky as they stepped outside, golden confetti still stuck in their hair. For the first time in a very long time, the grandmother didn't feel the cold. And for the first time in her little life, the girl believed the world could be kind. Their audition didn't just shock AGT. It changed two lives forever.